Hello, everyone. This is Bob Morris. I am the cap analyst and the writer for High Huddle and Sports Illustrated. Here to talk to you about the Denver Broncos and Justin Simmons. And as you are aware, the Broncos had Justin Simmons under the franchise tag for a little more than $11 million and were unable to come to terms with Simmons on a long-term deal. And I know that's disappointed a lot of Bronco fans, and I wanted to talk to everyone about some factors that people may not be looking at, because I see a lot of talk about that the Broncos are being either cheap or dumb or some simplistic argument when they're not stepping back and asking themselves what they may have been missing when it comes to the negotiations. I saw one remark that if the Broncos like Justin Simmons so much, they should do whatever it takes to sign him, and compare that to a person who's in love with somebody. That person will do whatever they could to please that person they love. But a contract negotiation is not like a wedding proposal. A contract negotiation involves one party who is offering to pay for something and a second party who is offering something in return for that money. So there's a buyer and a seller. In NFL player contract negotiations, the player is the seller. In most cases, the player is represented by an agent. The player and any agent representing him, they're tasked with getting the most money possible in a contract. So from this point forward, because Justin Simmons has an agent, I'll refer to agents. And the team is the buyer. And the buyer's task is to get the lowest possible price for whatever it intends to pay for. And in that case, the team is the Broncos, so we'll refer to the Broncos from this point forward. So let's start with the Broncos side. The first task they have is to determine how much they expect to pay Simmons, and that's based on the market for his position and his importance to the team. That's really what they're looking at. They're not looking at other factors. I mean, people think the ownership situation is the reason why, but they didn't look at that with other contracts, such as they didn't look at that last year with Juwan James. They didn't look at it this year with Graham Glasgow. They didn't look at that with Melvin Gordon or any other player that they've signed. So the ownership situation has nothing to do with it. Other players, they're not looking at, say, Jeff Hireman being on the roster where he's due $4 million on a cap hit, I should say. He's due a little less than that in the base salary, about $3 million, I believe. So, but that has nothing to do with it either, because if Jeff Hireman gets cut, which all indications are he probably will during a training camp, they don't owe him the $3 million. I won't get into Hireman and why he's still on the roster. And long story short, because they don't know yet if every tight end they've got is going to be healthy. And so there's a number of factors going into that. But the bottom line is they don't owe Hireman any money unless he's on the 53-man roster the first week of the regular season. So we're going to move. So we need to get back to Justin Simmons, and the Broncos are only going to look at the market for his position, his importance to the team, and then figure out, well, how do they determine the price that they expect to pay? And there's a difference between what they want to pay and they expect to pay. You know, most teams are probably going to want to pay as low as they can do because, well, that's just in the best interest of the team in just about every case. But it doesn't always work that way. And certainly for a player like Justin Simmons, it's not going to work that way. So they have to look at what they expect to pay. There are two ways to do this. The first is to set a price they would prefer to pay, but another higher price that they would be willing to pay if that's what it takes to get the deal done. And the other method is just go with the price they expect to pay and say, we won't go higher than that. But either way, if they start negotiations by offering the price they expect to pay as the initial offer, they will always pay more than that. And the reason is because Simmons' agent is thinking this way: to get the best possible deal for my client while keeping in mind the deal my client is most likely to get. So his agent will look at the market too and get an idea about what a final offer may be, but the team is going to consider what the team initially offers as well. So if the team offers the price they expect to pay as the initial offer, the agent is almost always going to ask for more. And the only time a good agent isn't going to ask for more is if the initial offer blows him away. And in most cases, that doesn't happen. So let's now take a look at specifics to understand how this works. So there's an argument that Simmons was going to get a deal for $15 million per year because you look at the top safeties that are getting $14 million or a little more than $14 million. So let's assume the Broncos were thinking the same thing. Now, if the Broncos go with setting a preferred price but are willing to go higher to get a deal done, they're probably going to look at, we expect $15 million, but we'd like to get $14 million. So they'll go at $14 million as our preferred price, but $15 million, we're willing to go up to that if that's what it takes to get the deal done. But that means the Broncos are not going to make $14 million the initial offer, because if they do that, they're certainly going to pay more than $14 million. And the same applies if they just decide, let's go with $15 million as the maximum we're going to pay, or what we expect to pay. But if they start at $15 million, they're going to have to pay more than $15 million. The agent is not just going to take that offer and be done with it. That's not how a negotiation works. So the correct negotiating strategy is the Broncos need to come in lower than those figures. So if you're going with, we prefer to pay $14 million, but we'd be willing to go $15 million to get a deal done, you're more likely going to come at $12 million or $12.5 million per year. But if you go with the other example where we're just going to say $15 million is what we expect to pay, they go $13 million. And so how is this relevant to what's been shared out there? Well, we'll start with the information that Mike Klisch shared. And he had a clumsily worded tweet that put the offer for Simmons as making him the 5th or the 6th highest paid safety in the NFL. And when you look at who's 5th highest paid, that's Earl Thomas at $13.75 million. And then next is Devin McCourty, $11.5 million. So now Mike Klisch doesn't say whether that's an initial offer, a take it or leave it offer from the get-go, meaning all the way back in April, that's where the Broncos were going to sit at that number and not come any higher, or whether that's the most recent offer made. And I seriously doubt it's the second instance because the Broncos don't work that way. They don't make an offer in April and just say every time point blank, we're not going to talk to you anymore for any reason. So that's not how they do things. In April, it's going to be their initial offer. I can pretty much guarantee you that. And then when they have later discussions, they're going to see about where they might make a higher offer, which I'll get to in a minute as to why that's important. So let's go back to whether that's an initial offer. Okay, so if we assume that the Broncos' initial offer was anywhere from $12 million to $13 million per year, well, where does that put the initial offer? It puts it between Earl Thomas and Devin McCourty. So if that's the initial offer, then you're actually using an offer that's for a negotiating strategy to get to where you're more likely to pay, where you're expected to pay, because that's your starting point. So, which in that case was if you're expected the end point to be $14 million or $15 million. If you think it's going to be $14 million, you start at $12 million. If you think it's at $15 million, you start at $13 million. You might start $12.5 million if it's $14 million deals. But either way, you're going to start between where Earl Thomas and Devin McCourty are currently making. So then that comes to what James Palmer talked about. And he described the offer putting Simmons at or near the top tier. But again, he's not saying was that an initial offer or the most recent offer. So we don't really know what the exact amount the Broncos offered to Simmons. Again, I'm giving you examples. And we also don't know whether what they're referring to is the original offer or the more recent offer. It's vague information that tells you a little, but doesn't tell you enough to know what's actually happening. And that's important because whenever a team leaks information to the media, the agent is going to counter in the same way. So you can look at Dak Prescott, who has the same agency that Simmons has. There's information leaked about the money that Prescott was turning down. And then more details got leaked that Prescott's sticking point was actually about the length of the contract, not the money. And it's not hard to figure out the Cowboys leaked the information about the money because when you hear money being thrown around, there's always the people who thinks that player is not worth that money. But when the news comes about contract length with regards to Prescott, it's clear it's not as simple as money. Now, to an extent, it is with Prescott, and I'll be very brief here because a shorter deal means he can hit the free agent market that much sooner, and if he keeps playing at a high level, he could be in line for a bigger payday down the road. So there's something that goes to money, but most of the time, when people are thinking about money, they're thinking about what's the contract offer right in front of them. So, but getting to the Broncos, they're often vague when they talk about the negotiations, and that's because they don't want to tip their hand too much publicly, and thus the agent would respond in kind. Now, the Broncos haven't been perfect with this. An example was always frustration over repeated questions about an extension for Chris Harris last year. He got testy with one of the people asking the question, and that got the agent upset and might have pushed Elway's hand a little more than he wanted it to. So that's an example where you have to be careful. But for the most part, they don't let a lot of information get out to the media. So we'll get back to Simmons again. So the Broncos were hoping to pay $14 million, but willing to go to $15 million to get a deal done. A negotiation that starts with an initial offer of $12 million, and then a later one that comes in at, say, $13.5 million, which is certainly a possibility. Those make sense from a team standpoint, and both offers put them in between Earl Thomas and Devin McCourty. So, again, if we assume $12 million was the initial offer, and then when they talked again, they went up to $13.5 million, then you're looking at basically the offer falls in between these two. What they're trying to do essentially is to look now at the other part of the equation, which is what Simmons' agent is seeking. So if Simmons' agent believes that Simmons should get $15 million as well, believes that should be as low as they go, anything number that he proposes is going to be more than $15 million, because we know a $12 million offer a year for Simmons isn't going to blow an agent away. So the agent is going to have to ask how much he should request in response in order to get the Broncos to raise their price. So if the Broncos start at $12 million and the agent comes back at $18 million, you can see the sides are too far apart. But if the agent counter with a $17 million request, then the Broncos might be willing to negotiate. They're still not close enough, but it tells the Broncos that, maybe we can get, it sounds like that they may be seeking $15 million, but maybe we can get them at $14 million. So we can try to come up a little closer to them and see what happens if they will come down or not. So, but on the other hand, let's say the Broncos started at $13 million and the agent countered with $17 million. There's a good chance you'll get to a deal, because it's probably not going to take much to get to that $15 million range for a contract. But on the other hand, start the offer from the Broncos at $13 million. The agent wants $18 million, and the Broncos are probably going to be hesitant to make a counteroffer. They're probably going to be more inclined to get the agent to come down a little bit, and if the agent doesn't do that, then the Broncos aren't necessarily going to come up that much. So, and when you call the Broncos cheap or dumb, that's a bad tape, because it ignores the fact that you need to properly negotiate so you actually do pay what you expect to pay. And again, if you expect to pay $15 million, you don't start there or even at $14 million, because in all likelihood, you're going to pay more. But on the other hand, agents and players aren't being greedy when they try to get deals higher than what the market dictates, because a good agent is always going to tell a player to not take the first offer he gets unless it blows the agent away. So with Justin Simmons, in order to get the agent to say, take the deal right now, you're going to have to offer him probably $18 million a year on the initial offer. And I imagine a lot of Broncos fans, even the ones who are disappointed that Simmons didn't extend, would say, Justin Simmons is not worth $18 million per year. So you can probably guess there's no chance the Broncos are going to make that an initial offer. But if they go $15 million a year, even if that's where you think the market is going, the agent is going to ask to hold out hope for more. And that's not greed. That's simply how a good agent negotiates. And the Broncos understand this, which is why they won't make an initial offer of $15 million. It's going to be less. And with all due respect to the people that are calling them cheap or dumb or whatever, it shows that they don't understand how to negotiate a contract, and they're not thinking enough about what both parties in the negotiation are thinking. Now, to those that talk about the future safety market, it remains to be seen what's going to happen there. So I'll talk about some of the potential free agents in 2021, and these are players with contracts that will expire after the 2020 season. So along with Simmons, Anthony Harris was on the franchise tag and didn't get a new deal. Then there's Budda Baker. Then there's Malik Hooker. Then there's Keanu Neal. Baker might get the franchise tag from the Cardinals in 2021. The Cardinals do have to make a decision on Patrick Peterson, so it's not a given that Baker will be tagged, but the Cardinals may prefer to extend Peterson on, say, a short-term deal and then go with tagging Baker. And that's all going to depend on how the Cardinals want to do business with both players. So the Colts, they didn't pick up Malik Hooker's fifth-year option, so I don't think they're going to tag him. And Neal, well, the Falcons have cap issues, so he's probably not getting tagged. And it's not a given the Vikings are going to tag Harris again. So, yes, it's possible they could reset the market, but it's just as possible they could go lower than that. So if all those players hit the free agent market and they got $15 million per year, then yes, Simmons' price is going to rise. But if teams instead say, well, they're only like the $12 million to $13 million range, then Simmons' price, he can't push his price up, because if they come into 12, those other free agents come in at 12 million to 13 million, then where's the leverage for Simmons? The Broncos can pretty much hold their ground and say, now we know we have evidence that we can say we're only going to pay you 14 million. So there is indeed risk for the Broncos, but there's risk for Simmons that the market doesn't play out the way he hopes. Or in the case of the Broncos, and again, yes, it's true, the market may not play out the way for the Broncos, but it could just easily not play out for Simmons. I'll get to some more examples in a minute, but I want to stick with the safeties. There's Jamal Adams, of course. He's a possibility for an extension, but that's only going to happen if he's traded. And you heard the reported demand of $20 million per year for Adams, but I suspect that's Adam and his agent setting the bar so high that they hope the Jets would do whatever it took to trade him. But it's clear that Adams doesn't really want to play for the Jets, so at this point, I don't think he's going to sign an extension with them. So unless he's traded, he's just going to be sitting on his current rookie deal. There's some people that talk about Minkah Fitzpatrick, but I don't think you're going to see a contract extension happening for Fitzpatrick at this time. The Steelers are not the type of team that goes and extends a player the instant he's eligible for an extension. So that's next year is when he would be eligible for an extension. And again, the Steelers are not the type of team that always does that. It's possible, but the Steelers are not likely to do that right out of the gates like the Bears did with Eddie Jackson. Of course, Eddie Jackson was entering the fourth year of his deal. He didn't have the fifth-year option, but the Bears didn't wait once their season was over. They went right in and extended Jackson. The Steelers, they'll have Fitzpatrick, will be in the fourth year of his deal, but there's the fifth-year option to consider. The Steelers, in all likelihood, they're going to pick up the fifth-year option, but they're not going to jump right into an extension that quickly. That's not how the Steelers operate. They tend to be a little more conservative. That doesn't mean they're going to try to underpay Fitzpatrick. It just means they're not going to be tripping over themselves to get a deal done as quickly as possible. So, and that brings me to the argument that the player who is next in line always gets the bigger contract, but it's not always that simple. And I bring you to the off-ball linebacker market, and I've talked about this before on Mile High Huddle. You can look how it was in 2019 compared to 2020. In 2019, Quan Alexander, then C.J. Mosley, then Bobby Wagner all set the bar higher than anyone could have anticipated for off-ball linebackers. But then in 2020, Shaq Thompson came in lower than Alexander, and you can make the argument that Thompson isn't as good as Wagner or a healthy Mosley, and you could say that because he stayed with the Panthers, that he may have taken a little less than he might have gotten if he negotiated with another team. But that's not so easily said with Corey Littleton, Joe Schobert, and Blake Martinez. And I certainly grant you on Bobby Wagner. I grant you with a heavily Mosley, but when it comes to Quan Alexander, I'm not convinced there. Littleton and Schobert are arguably better players than Alexander. And Martinez, he wasn't coming off his best season as a pro, but you still might say that, generally speaking, Martinez is a better player than Alexander. But none of those players exceeded Alexander. So the next in line didn't get the next biggest contracts. And again, with Wagner and Mosley, it's one thing to say about those two. But with Alexander, you would think that these players would get more money than Alexander did. And they didn't. So next in line didn't happen that way. Now, next in line can certainly happen with quarterbacks, but there's always going to be exceptions like Patrick Mahomes. We know what he got. Dak Prescott, we know he's not going to get that. And I'm not talking just a 10-year deal, but the average per year salary. Prescott is not going to get that. And it sometimes applies to the pass rushers, but 4-3 scheme, those in 4-3 schemes tend to get more than those in 3-4 schemes. Now, that's not always the case. Von Miller got a pretty big payday, but in many cases, Von Miller would be an exception. I should rephrase that. But Von Miller would be an exception, and that's because 4-3 defensive ends who are edge rushers are treated as defensive linemen under the franchise tag, while 3-4 outside linebackers, also edge rushers, are treated as linebackers under the tag. So because the tag for D linemen is higher than the tag for linebackers, 4-3 defensive ends often get an advantage in negotiations because they have a higher tag to negotiate with. And we're seeing this play out with Shaq Barrett and Bud Dupree. They're both 3-4 outside linebackers. They both got the tag, and they filed grievances because they want to be considered 4-3 defensive ends. So the market's more complicated than people realize, and there's a lot that goes into negotiations that fans never see. And teams might reveal a portion of their hand, but they don't reveal it all. And some teams reveal next to nothing, which is pretty much what the Broncos are. They reveal next to nothing about negotiations, and the agents are going to respond in kind depending on what the team reveals. So Simmons' agent, he's going to give people next to nothing if he talks, in all likelihood. He's not going to leak a ton of details to try to necessarily counter what the Broncos are saying. So, and it's fine if you're disappointed that the Broncos didn't get a deal done with Simmons, but it's important to understand understand negotiations and how they work. And if you just drop a contract you think Simmons is worth right in front of him from the start, you're not doing negotiations the right way. So anyway, that's all I have to say on that subject. I will might be doing in the future some more podcasts, so we'll keep an eye out for those. At any rate, this is Bob Morris with the Mile High Huddle and Sports Illustrated signing off. I will see you later.